Okay, folks, I'm going to introduce our next talk. We are very fortunate to have Teresa Leach and Neil Guthrie here from LiRN to give us an update. Teresa is the inaugural Managing Director of LiRN, who you all know quite well, I'm sure. And Neil Guthrie is the Chair of LiRN, and he is also the Director of Professional Development, Research, and Knowledge Management at Airden Bearless in Toronto. So thank you both for being here, and I think Teresa's going to start off with a bit of a presentation.
Thank you, and hello to everybody who I haven't said hello to yet. And thank you to Alan and Doug for inviting us here today to give you a bit of an update. So I do have a presentation I'm going to go through and give you a few updates about things that have been happening at LiRN, and then I believe there'll be some time for Neil and I to take questions. So a few things that I want to cover today, some updates around accounting, some website enhancements that we've made recently, a new project that we just recently launched called the Key Network Processes, an update about the Innovation and Equity of Access in Ontario Courthouse Libraries project, which I usually just call the LFO project for short. That is the project that we were fortunate enough to receive funding from the Law Foundation of Ontario earlier this year. I'm going to tell you about a new document that we've created that gives a little bit of background information about LiRN for new association board members, and then we'll get into the 2025 budget process. So on the accounting side of things, we have established a new email address for accounting questions. It's going to go live before the end of the year. So the questions will go directly to our accountants rather than going to me or Jackie or Tanya and then ending up being forwarded to the accountants. It's going to go straight to them, and their pledge to us is to get responses back with a week's turnaround time at the most. A representative from Welch, who is our accounting firm that we've worked with, as I said, will review your question and respond back to you. She'll loop me in or anybody else in as required, but they will be answering the questions directly. They're also working on an accounting FAQ. So we'd sent out a survey that had a number of questions about what people would like to know more about in terms of accounting. We got a number of answers back, and the accountants are working on an FAQ sheet that responds to not just the frequently asked questions, but all of the questions that they received in that document. And we are looking to get that out by the end of the year as well. And along the same lines, those questions are being used to prep for 2 accounting sessions that will be available. One in November that sort of covers the frequently asked questions and fundamentals. And then in January, they're going to hone in on payroll. Turning to our website, we've made a few enhancements to the website recently. One of the things that we introduced about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, we introduced a curriculum for your library staff, professional development that is delivered internally, mostly by other staff members throughout the network, sometimes by our provider, our benefits provider, who has interesting sessions on mental health and things like that. So in addition to that, there's a lot of soft knowledge that goes around the network where people ask each other questions and they hear the answers. And we're trying to capture some of that in the form of a wiki on the website. So all of this information that's being accumulated can be accessed from one central point in the website. We have fairly fulsome articles at the moment, although some of them still need to be finalized. And on each article, there is the opportunity for people to contribute additional knowledge to that. We're also updating the library profile pages. So we do have library profiles up on our site. They're very minimal at the moment. And while we were making sure that we had links to those associations that have websites, on our library profiles, we decided to enhance the profiles as well. So we're getting information from library staff to create more informative profiles that include staff names, pictures of the library, unique details, and then the bread and butter things like the hours and contact information and things like that. So that was just a quick update about the website. Turning to the Key Network Processes project, you will have heard about it if you saw my recent email on this subject. So this project is focusing on bringing the libraries across the province together to work even better together, to work even more seamlessly together by taking a close look at the key processes that everybody is undergoing and seeing if there's ways that we can bring efficiencies or make it work better, or maybe we just keep our hands off of it and it works better the way it is, but we want to undergo the process of looking at whether or not there's ways that we can enhance what's already going on. My go-to example of this is the interlibrary loan system that we've got going, because that works, as far as I've been told, extremely well. So it's that great example of all of the disparate libraries across the network working well together to make sure that everybody has access to the resources that are necessary and making the most out of the resources that are available across the system. So if somebody in York, I'm looking at Betty, has a resource that they need in Temiskaming, then that exchange can happen. It keeps collection costs down, it keeps everybody working together. So are there more things out there that we can do something similar? Hopefully, and we will find out as we go through this project. We're starting consultations in November. We're starting with our board and with our shareholders. So I believe our admin assistant is currently trying to find dates that work for everybody there. We will be reaching out to the association presidents and giving them an opportunity to sit down with our consultant as well, and also with library staff to see, as they're on the grounds, they probably have pretty good ideas of what could be working better if it were more centralized or more efficient. So you'll be hearing more about that over the course of this year and Q1 and Q2 of next year. Moving to the LFO project, as you know, there are two streams of this project. One is the Innovation Sandbox, and the other is Collections Enhancement. Sorry. So the Innovation Sandbox it's kind of a fun, exciting one. There's not really been much of an opportunity to innovate because innovation takes time, tolerance of failure, and money. And that's not something that's in abundance. So with the funds that the LFO have provided us, we've asked people to take some time. Thank you so much, Alan. Sorry about that. We've asked that people take some time to consider what kinds of innovations they would like to see in their library and submit to us those ideas. So we have received a few applications for individual associations that had great ideas for innovation, and we're working our way through that right now. At the recent Learn with LiRN annual conference, a professional development opportunity for library staff, we had a brainstorming session with staff that was led by one of our board members, Vicki Whitmell, to talk about what kind of problems they see in the library network that could perhaps be solved through innovation. So we went through this process of identifying problems, talking about potential solutions, and getting into that a little bit, getting into the ideas a little bit. And that was a very fruitful session. We resulted in several different ideas that came forth, and you see some of them on the slide. Things like remote access, which comes up often. It's a long-standing conversation between LiRN and I'm sure many other libraries with the legal vendors to talk to them about their licensing model. When we ask them to talk about remote service or remote access, it's always a conversation of, well, you'll have to pay for every single lawyer in Ontario. And we're trying to move them to a Libby-like or Overdrive-like system where we buy 200 licenses and then you can check out the license, which is the logical way of going about it. But There hasn't been a lot of movement on that, but it is something that we can dive into a little bit deeper. We've had suggestions, and we've called it here after hours assistance. That's not really, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's more about providing consistent assistance to library users during regular business hours. So not all of our libraries can be open or are open every day and for the entire day. Some people are there for part-time, and that's great. But we want people to be able to get answers outside of those hours as well. And there are 1-800 numbers that are used, but that might be a way that we can enhance those offerings a little bit more. So we're going to look into those. Our next step for that is that I am going to be doing a sit down with Vicki and doing a deep dive into the ideas that came up during the brainstorming process and the individual ideas that came out as well. We're going to do a deep dive into those and sort of talk about which ones seem the most feasible in terms of money that we have allocated from the project, time that we have, willingness of other people like vendors to play ball with us, that kind of thing. So as we go through that process, we'll sort of hone in on, I'm not sure how many projects it will be. It'll probably be 2, maybe 3 projects that look like likely starters. And then in addition to that, we'll do the deep dive into the individual projects. And so at that point, we'll have more information to share with this group about where this project is going. But so far, we've made some good progress on identifying some potential projects. The ones that are here on the chart are not exhaustive. There are many pages from easels that were filled up during the brainstorming session that we still have to finish pouring through and make sure that we have captured all of the ideas. On the collection enhancement side of things, we've received applications from across the network on that. So the idea being to try to get as much of the network up to the core list standard as possible. And I use the word standard loosely here. The entire core list doesn't apply to every library, and some libraries have different needs that don't show up on the core list, but the core list is a very good sort of baseline to use when you're developing what your collection should look like and what you need for your users. So that's kind of the loose standard that we're using. So we've got all those applications in. Jackie is going through them right now and is doing a bit of a deep dive into prioritizing and timing it out so that we can make best use of the funds that we have. And you'll be hearing back from us about that towards the end of the month. The backgrounder for new association board members. So we created just a short manual that talks about what LiRN is, where are the legislation that created us, the bylaw 13, and all of that sort of background information that those of you who have been in the system for a long time already know, but an incoming board member might not be all that familiar with who we are and what we do and what our various processes are. So we're hoping that this backgrounder will be of assistance to incoming board members, where you can just pass it on to them, and it's a bit of a primer on LiRN. That should be going out next week after this plenary, so we'll be sending it around to everybody at that point. The 2025 budget process. So just a quick note on the 2024 budget process. I guess I could have opened with this, but Convocation has approved LiRN's budget for 2024. We're in 2023 now. It's 2024 budget, which is great news. The salary adjustments that many of the associations had gone through, the role descriptions and salary matrix that our HR consultant had developed, and put in a case for staff salaries to be adjusted. Those adjustments were approved. There were cases submitted for retroactive payment that did not go forward. But we are happy to say that the salary adjustments, the raises across the system did go forward, so we're very happy about that. For next year, So a few points to hit while I'm talking about next year's project process. Going to give you some general information, some draft dates, and I emphasize draft because I'm still working with our treasurer, not the treasurer, LiRN's treasurer, on whether or not these dates work for them. And then a word about business cases and excess fund balances. So general information, this is something that we all know already. LiRN is accountable for ensuring that the funds we administer are used as intended to provide law library services and programs to lawyers in Ontario. And in support of that, we ask that associations submit a budget in support of their grant requests. So they should reflect, insofar as possible, all of the anticipated costs for the upcoming year. It's not always possible to anticipate everything. There's circumstances, for example, where your photocopier breaks down and you hadn't accounted for that, and you'll need some cash to make a new copier happen. It's just as an example. So we're not. The expectation isn't that you are clairvoyant and you see everything coming and no exceptions will be made. But we do ask that you make best efforts to anticipate what you're going to need for the upcoming year. Our draft dates, sometime in Q2, and the exact date will be finalized. We will be able to notify you about any excess fund balances that have accumulated during the year or during the previous year. In June, we'll be looking for the business cases and excess fund balance proposals. And also in June, we'd be looking at the budgets being due. The idea behind having two different due dates for that is to get all of the business cases and proposals in and reviewed, and any questions that need to be asked about them done prior to finalizing the budget, so it just makes the process a little bit easier and smoother if there are back and forth that needs to happen. During July and August is when LiRN's Audit and Finance Committee looks at the budget and the explanatory materials that go along with it. Once LiRN's Audit and Finance Committee is done reviewing it, perhaps suggesting changes, revisions, whatever they would like to see. Once that has been approved by the Audit and Finance Committee, we bring it to our Board of Directors. Once the Board of Directors has approved it, it's usually days, minutes before our deadline to get it into the Law Society. The Law Society's Audit and Finance Committee generally considers our budget in September. And then in October or November, Convocation considers our budget and says yea or nay on it. I say October to November. It's generally in October. My first year with LiRN, it ended up being November, so I know that there are instances where it does take longer. That's obviously out of our hands, but generally speaking, that would be October. And then in November is when the grant letters are sent in. So I'm sure some of you are wondering when you'll see the grant letters for this year. Not working on them this week. I'm not working on them tomorrow, sorry, but we're aiming to get those out mid to late November. So we'll be working on them once we get back to the office next week and getting those out. Taking just a quick moment to look through the budget template itself, and this is last year's template. There might be some tweaks going forward. You'll see that the dates are all relevant to last year. So this is just an example so that we can get into a little bit about the various buckets. On the revenue side of things, the LiRN grant is the bulk of revenue, and that's for many associations the only revenue. Some associations do contribute to the cost of operating the library, so we ask that you let us know what this amount is. And we'll probably be doing a little bit of investigating about that and just sort of understanding what that money is going towards and looking at that with a closer eye. Not in terms of telling you that you can or can't do it. Sorry, I just realized how that sounded. But in terms of understanding whether, where it's coming from, what it's paying for, is there something that we should be bringing into LiRN or things like that. And then many libraries have other revenue, things like photocopier or printer revenue, which are starting to come back a little bit with foot traffic slightly increasing after COVID, but I believe are still down for many people. When it comes to expenses, we do have a chart of accounts that we have sent out to all of the associations. We revised it earlier this year because there were just some inconsistencies and some holdovers from previous editions where it would make sense to file something under multiple places in the chart of accounts, just the way things had evolved. So we tried to clean it up a little bit. We sent it around, got some feedback, cleaned it up, and now we're looking to get everybody onto the chart of accounts for the beginning of next year. So we're all using the same line items. Makes it much easier for reporting where we don't have to question what exactly is meant by this line item. The buckets that we use are electronic subscriptions, collection expenses, payroll expenses, operating expenses, capital expenses, and there is a bucket for other, which is, I call it the rarely used other. I actually don't think it's ever used, but we have it there in case there's some sort of strange miscellaneous expense that doesn't fit nicely in anywhere else. I'm not going to go through these in much detail, but just as a high-level example, the electronic subscriptions are for electronic subscriptions. So if you have a resource that is available both in print and electronic, we'd like to see it under the electronic resources. It helps us understand what our electronic resources look like around the system and whether or not there are other opportunities for centralization under LiRN. Lets us keep an eye on some of the more popular expenses and that kind of thing. The collection is for the rest of the collection. So it's print resources, it's loose leaves, things like that. Payroll expenses, I think, is fairly straightforward, so I don't anticipate going into that. Operating expenses are sort of your day-to-day office expenses, your what it costs to run the library. So printers, papers, pens, telephone, internet, accounting software, leases on copiers as opposed to purchased copiers. So purchased copiers would go under the capital expenses. And we ask here that you include professional development expenses that you anticipate for the librarians for the upcoming year. You don't need to account for Learn with LiRN, the annual conference, in this section. That comes out of our centralized budget, so there's no need to go into that. This is for things like the CALL conference or AALL, which are commonly attended across the network. Just a quick note further on that, because previously we have asked that you provide a business case if you're sending a librarian to AALL or CALL. We're doing away with that. We don't need to see business cases for that. As a practical reason, I've gotten ahead of myself. The reason we ask that you include the professional development in your individual association budgets as opposed to the centralized LiRN budget is as a practical reason. We don't want to see ad hoc requests coming in over the course of the year. That makes it difficult for us to manage our central LiRN budget. And also, it's just, as the employer, it makes sense for the association to be the one saying yes or no. You can go to CALL, you can go to AALL. I called it philosophically, just makes sense for that to happen. I don't think it's such a common expense across the network. It doesn't seem like it's something that we really need to be seeing business cases for, and they do tend to be kind of repetitive in that it's a library staff person going to a library conference. There's not much more to be said about it than that. As I mentioned, the Learn with LiRN conference is an exception. You don't need to put that in your budget. We cover the costs of that in our centralized budget. We do have a program where if one of your library staff wants to take a library technician diploma. That is funding available for that. But we do ask, yes, that it be in your business, in your budget, but we do ask that you submit a business case along with that. And that's because of the length of the commitment and the size of the commitment that we would be making. We want to have a chance to turn our mind to that. Capital expenses tend to be the one-off purchases, so things like the copier that's not leased but rather bought, we would want to see here. We ask that you take a good look at your needs for the upcoming year, and if your copier is kind of on its last legs, maybe anticipate that you're going to be replacing it in the upcoming budget year and include those replacement costs in there. Generally speaking, we'd like to see a business case to go along with that. They tend to be fairly straightforward. You need a copier to run the library, but we'd like to see sort of what you've looked at and the options you've considered and that kind of thing. And again, the other category, the catch-all category, in case you can't find anything else. I would ask that if you're planning on using the other category, please just send me an email. Let me know that you have an expense that you can't seem to find another spot for, and you're thinking of using the other category, and then we can sort of talk together about whether or not there is a place that makes better sense for it. As mentioned before, business cases for capital expenses, library technician program bursaries, unusually high grant requests, which is admittedly a vague thing to say. What is unusually high? That's a difficult question for any of us to answer. I think the best advice I can give you is looking back at your history. If you've generally been looking at smaller increases, and then you're going to have a 10% jump this year, maybe give us a heads up on that one. If it is going to be unusually high, and you don't consider it unusually high, and I do, I would probably be reaching out to you during that gap between the final budget and the business expense. So I guess I wouldn't have your business, but I will be reaching out to you to talk about that. It's not something that I would anticipate seeing very often, generally speaking. The increases tend to be similar across the board, and if it is a large increase, it's because of something you've already submitted a business case for. You've got a new employee, or you're opening longer hours, whatever, along those lines. So it's not something that would just come out of the blue for most cases. And then the requests to use excess fund balances, which we also sometimes refer to as the EFB proposals. It's essentially a business case to use those funds, so I classified it under the business cases. Fairly straightforward. If the business case is accepted, it's included in the budget. If it's not, then it's not included in the budget. Moving on to the excess fund balances. So a fund balance develops where there's an excess of grant funds that haven't been spent on operating the library. The Board of Directors approved a grant administration policy back in 2021 on the advice of our auditor, and it caps the amount of the fund balance in the library's account at 10% of the annual grant from LiRN. They're calculated through taking the total fund balance, subtract 10% of the current year's grant, and then the result is, if there is any, an excess fund balance if it's a positive result. In 2023, earlier this year, the board approved an annual process for recovering the EFBs, which is to calculate the EFB for the previous year, provide an opportunity for proposals, and then deduct any amounts remaining after approved proposals from the following year's grant. The timing of that proposal for this year meant that associations' notifications went out in June, and we'd asked for the proposals by July 31st. It was a shortened timeline. But now that the process is approved by the board and is in place, we'll be able to fit it into the normal budget process. So we'd be giving you the information earlier in the year and asking for proposals around the same time that you're doing your budget, so it can all sort of flow into the budget process. So again, next year, Q1 to Q2, LiRN's accountants are working on calculating it based on the information that we've received. In Q2, we'll be able to notify the associations if you do have an EFB, which gives you then the opportunity to look at what you might want to spend that on. Perhaps you'd kept it back because there was going to be a great sale on copiers and you wanted to buy it then. There's lots of different reasons why these accumulate. So you could then put together the proposal and submit it along with the business cases, if any, that are going forward for the budget. The board will make its decision on the proposals and associations will be notified of the decision. This again is draft timing. We're kind of working out the details, but this is most likely what the timing is going to look like. If you have an accepted proposal, you would include the business expenses in the budget as you would for any business case. And I don't want to get into all the details of exactly how to do that. They will be part of the template, and we'll put out an explainer for the staff to go through it with them. And if the proposal is declined, much like any business case, then it would not go into the budget. So those are the updates. I think questions? I don't know how long I took, but I'm sure we have time.
Oh yeah, we do definitely have time. So questions, if people would go to one of the microphones as we did earlier today, I appreciate that.
Joan from the Toronto Lawyers Association. So excess fund balances are not actually as simple as revenue less expenses. We know that the trial balance is used, and the trial balance pulls from the balance sheet. The balance sheet in large associations like ours is an amalgamation of association and library funds. I've raised this issue, and I'm wondering if we're going to be getting any clarification on any of that.
Thanks, Joan. Association and library funds should be kept separate. We have been using the trial balances, and we have had feedback from you and others that they would prefer if we used audited financial statements as opposed to trial balances for that calculation. It is my understanding that not all associations are currently getting audited financial statements, and we don't want to start placing that obligation on people. So I can't really speak to what the ultimate result is. It's a lot of complex moving parts, but we are looking into whether or not there's a possibility that could accommodate either a trial balance or an audited financial statement in the association's choice of which to put forward as the document that most accurately represents the finances. So I think that's about as specific as I can get at this moment. Neil, correct me if you have.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to point out that I did speak to my auditor about this, and he did clarify that a trial balance, just by the nature of a trial balance, does not separate the association and the library funds. He explained it to me as a science and not as an art, and I think that that has to be recognized. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan.
Other questions?
I'm sorry, can I ask a question of Joan? I just want to make sure I've written this down correctly, what you said. By the nature of the trial balance, it combines the association and...
So the trial balance is pulled from the balance sheet, and the balance sheet isn't segregated by association and library funds. A balance sheet mushes everything together. So when we produce a trial balance and it says excess revenue, you're looking at revenue from the associations and the library, not just the library revenue. And that's what's causing the problem. So it looks like we have a lot of excess revenue when we only had like $12,000 last year. And you guys are reading it as a larger amount because my association made some money. So we have to figure that one out.
Okay, I do not have the accounting expertise to comment any further than that. I just wanted to make sure I wrote it down correctly so I could ask the accountants, essentially.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
During one of our Zoom discussions, I think it was late last year or earlier this year when we were talking about this new salary grid and matrix and whatnot, one of the discussions that came up that a number of associations had was, we know LiRN continuously tells the associations that staffing and whatnot is your problem. Of course, at the same time, with the salary matrix and increased salaries, we're starting to have librarians with significantly high salaries. And the question was, what if we end up into an employment situation where, for instance, there's a termination or there's something, and we asked if LiRN would have money set aside, probably working with LiRN, not just to use, but if we end up into a dispute with one of our staff or something, is there going to be money there that we can sort of grasp onto if we need to, if there's an employment situation?
Do you have an answer? So I just want to make sure, because I was writing as you went. So your question is around whether or not there would be funds from LiRN if there's a staffing issue? Like
Like a termination. So on termination, there would
Oh,
be
gotcha.
notice severance potentially due to an employee. And the question is whether LiRN has considered any provision for that, because it was brought up, I think, in the May plenary.
yeah,
Or
and
worst case scenario, if there was a lawsuit or something from the employee or something like that.
Neil may want to correct me if he disagrees, but I believe that would be sort of a case-by-case thing. I don't think that LiRN would provide funding if it were a case of
Bad conduct?
yeah, thank you. My mind was blanking on the term. Where in other scenarios, it may and has in the past covered that. So I think it's, at least I'm having difficulty answering that in the abstract, but I think on a case-by-case basis, there may be funds for that, depending on the circumstances of the employment issue. Would you agree, Neil?
I was going to say, we could check with our treasurer. I think she's probably got the historical knowledge about that.
Yeah, there's only one that I know of personally, and that, you know, some of the funding did come, or the entire funding did come from LiRN. So I know it has happened in the past where we have covered that kind of scenario. I just don't want to say a sweeping statement, because I do think that individual circumstances may change that answer. So I think that's the best I can say at the moment.
Thank you so much. Other questions? We do have some time. Yep, go ahead.
You
Sorry.
can't see me because there's.
No, I know, you're right. It is difficult. I apologize
see
from
you.
where I'm sitting. I can't.
Two of the three can see me, so I'll go with that.
Thank you.
So I'm VP of the Prescott-Russell Law Association, so we're really small, although I was surprised that there's a lot smaller associations here. But we cover a big geographical area. And our issue is that our courthouse and our library and everything are in L'Orignal, which is probably one of the smallest villages in all of Prescott-Russell. And there's very few local lawyers. So unless you're physically going to court, you don't really have access to the library. So one of the things that we were discussing this year as an association is centralized and digital use of stuff. So I know you mentioned it during your update that there's issues with publishing, licensing, and all that stuff. But it's not just the books that we have to look at. One of the things that we were looking at earlier this year is a subscription to what's called Rangefinder. And it's great for criminal lawyers because you can pop in a whole bunch of stuff and find great decisions on sentencing. But to buy it individually makes no sense. To buy one license and put it at a library that, in all honesty, almost nobody goes to is ridiculous. And in looking at this, I reached out to different associations and I found out that I think it's in Alberta where the province has the program, and with lawyers and paralegals, or I think there's just lawyers, they have a digital access code, like password, username, and whatnot, and they can access it from anywhere. Is LiRN looking at anything like that for stuff that would not be a per user fee?
Yes. Just a special shout out to one of our eLearn vendors, VLEX, we do have a pilot program for remote access in northern communities that we're looking at expanding currently. But we've also, it's funny you mentioned Rangefinder, and with all the caveats, we have been discussing that particular vendor and looking at various options in addition to Rangefinder, but Rangefinder is, I would say, top of our list. And we've been actively discussing how we can work to make that happen. So I can't say anything very specific, but I can say it's something that we're actively working on.
Other questions?
Excuse me. I'm not sick, I'm just tired of talking.
If there are no other questions, we'll call it to this session to an end. We do have a little bit more time, but if that's it, then
You'll see us at dinner if you come up with a question between now and then.
wonderful. Excellent.
Or at least me, I shouldn't speak for Neil.
Thank you so much for coming, guys. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody.